This is In-Ear Insights, the Trust Insights podcast. In this week's In-Ear Insights, we are talking influencer marketing, network graphing databases, and so much more. So as we talked about on last week's show, one of the things that we found in our Instagram analysis was that Instagram influencers, for good or ill, are 4 times as effective as brands in terms of just getting engagement on Instagram. And so that naturally brings up the question, well, then how do you find these influencers? How do you know who's the real deal and who's just, talking to themselves a lot? We all know plenty of people who love to wax rhapsodic on the internet and pose their deep questions to the universe, but sometimes the universe doesn't really respond. So, Katie, when you think about identifying influencers and who even constitutes an influencer, what do you think about, and how is it different from, most number of followers or, largest number of engagement?
When I think about a good, solid, valuable internet influencer, I'm using the word internet because it kind of covers the different social media channels. So it could be Instagram, Twitter, whatever, but basically it's someone who's making those connections. It's someone who is a subject matter expert in their space, whether it be fashion, beauty, MarTech, IT, whatever it is, and who can, bring people into a conversation. And it's almost like you just want that influencer to start the conversation so that other people can continue it on and reference back to that person. But you don't necessarily, I think the problem with influencers is that sometimes you're looking for someone who's just like shouting at everybody and just making noise and who's the loudest. But I don't think that that's a really good, valuable influence. You might get a lot of eyeballs on it, but that doesn't mean that people are going to engage and take action with whatever this influencer is saying. So when I think about influencers, I think about someone who is, that idea starter, that conversation starter, that seed planter who can say, hey guys, I'm going to drop a little nugget of information here, go run with it. And it sort of spreads far and wide, but always references back to that person who started the conversation.
Sounds like a conspiracy theorist leader. Like, here, go do your own research.
Well, maybe. I mean, that's a type of influencer.
It certainly is. Yeah. It's funny. A number of years ago, we wrote a book. It's no longer in circulation. Maybe we should dust it off and update it on identifying influencers. And the 3 categories that we came up with at the time were, sort of the thought leader, the person who, for the people who are old like me, there were commercials back in the 70s and 80s for a financial expert called E.F. Hutton. And the tagline to their commercials was, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. And it was all these things like, he was on a train, he started to talk, and everyone on the train stopped and looked at him. So you have that sort of that thought leader. And those are people who don't have to be loud. In fact, usually they're not. In the marketing space, one of the ones that people reference the most is Seth Godin, right? And he isn't on social media. He really doesn't participate. But yet he's that thought leader. Then you have the middle group we call network hubs or mayors, if you will, the people who know everybody. And again, those are folks that they don't have to be loud, but they know everybody. And you say, hey, I need to get a meeting with the VP of marketing at Dell, and they're like, oh yeah, Bob and I went to college together, or Bob's my cousin's friend's whatever kind of thing. And those are the people that, particularly for B2B, those are the influencers that will land multi-million-dollar deals. And then the third category is, like you said, the Kardashians, the loud people and stuff. One of the challenges, though, that you have with a lot of influencer marketing software out there is that it's only really good at that latter category.
Yeah, it's because I think that there's still not a lack of understanding of influencers, but on behalf of companies, sort of a lack of, long-term planning of how influencers could be used to boost their brand. And so a lot of times it's well, we have this event going on. Who can we get who can reach the most people to promote our stuff? Which is a fine and decent plan, but there's no real long-term thinking in that. Is that person going to stay with your brand long-term to really help be an ambassador for it. Because that's really what you're after, is a brand ambassador, someone who's going to constantly be known and associated with your brand. And, so Chris, to your point, someone like Seth Godin, like if he's not on social media, but people are referencing him, if he starts saying like, oh, you know what, I exclusively work with Trust Insights, well, everyone's going to move to start paying attention to what the heck it is that we're doing. And so that's the kind of longer term planning that, we would want to be thinking about, especially in the B2B space. In the consumer space, I do think it's a little bit different, especially if you're just looking for that like celebrity thumbs up of endorsement, because you can kind of like switch out influencers depending on who's hot that minute. Which again it's short-term thinking, unless you're going to be building up that influencer along with your brand to keep them long-term.
Yeah, that really is the catch. And so one of the challenges I think that marketers face in the influencer marketing space is the fact that most of the software really is not tuned to identifying anything other than the loud people. Like the loud people are easy. You can, and many pieces of software do say like this person has 142 million followers. Taylor Swift has the follower base of a large nation. Like the only difference between Taylor Swift and a nation is that most nations have navies, and Taylor Swift does not yet. We'll see.
Is that on our list of things to do, is to build a navy?
I mean,
might be.
writing albums during the pandemic and stuff like that. Who knows? Anything's possible. But the other categories of influencers are harder to see because for two reasons. One, not all the data is available. Like certainly you can see some of what happens on Twitter, which is probably the most used and possibly the most overused network for influencer identification. You can see some of the data on Instagram. You really can't see much on Facebook, and you can see zero on LinkedIn. And so it becomes very difficult to identify those other classes of influencer. But the other challenge that people run into is they don't have the technology background to digest that data and turn it into something useful.
I'm assuming that there are. I've never personally had to look for this kind of software, but are there off-the-shelf pieces of software that will identify influencers for you? And to your point, Chris, do they just look for like, largest number of followers?
There are tons of influencer identification, companies out there. And a large number of them either look at one of two things: who's got the loudest mouth or the biggest audience, right? And on the B2C side, at least, who gets decent amounts of engagement on a per piece basis. That's about it. There isn't much else out there. On the B2B side, there are a couple of additional pieces of software out there, like Tracker, Analytica, a few others that do have slightly more sophistication. We actually were at a marketing conference where we had a chat with the CTO of Analytica for a while, and we're discussing the different algorithms they use and stuff. And I have a philosophical difference between them, but at least that they're using more advanced technology.
So it sounds like there's a couple of limitations based on what's available right off the shelf. And the limitation might be what it is that you want to do with an influencer. And so if you're looking for someone to, grow along with your brand, you might not be able to find that person through these, pieces of software because of their lack of following for now. You could probably tune it to say, I want someone who's in this space with this many followers, but you really need to do the work to get on those platforms before this is my opinion. I feel like you need, like, if you want an Instagram influencer, you need to get on Instagram and start looking and searching and doing that manual, like, what does this person look like? How do they engage? You can do that with some of the software, but nothing replaces really just getting into that platform itself and seeing who's there.
Yep. And one of the things I think is philosophically different that in the way we approach it than others do is in what constitutes influence, right? So again, most platforms, most software, most people think, okay, who is talking the most, right? Who's the conversation starter? And at least in in the graphing software we use what's called network graphing software, to look at the interactions between different people. I like to look at who is most talked about, because again, Seth Godin, not on social media, but yet Seth Godin, everybody talks about him.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at Twitter mentions or Instagram mentions or any of the mentions that are available on these different data feeds, it's more important, I think, to see who's talking about you rather than who you're talking about, because you can wax poetic all day long, and post 100,000 pieces of content on LinkedIn, but if nobody ever talks about you, then you don't have presence of mind. Your brand is not top of mind. Whereas if people are talking about you constantly, you've gotten into people's heads. And so from a computational perspective of influence, I think there's a lot more value in knowing who is most talked about. And then, obviously that whoever those people are, if they start referencing you, like you were saying, if you have someone who's talked about as the revered expert, and they mention trust insights, like, wow, people will pay attention to that. There's folks in every industry who are just, they are the folks that everybody looks to and follows to see what they recommend. And when they recommend something, the classical example in the B2C world is when Oprah mentions a product, that company had better be ready, because they're going to sell out immediately.
So, we looked at some of this data on last week's live stream. We looked at the hashtag marketing Twitter. So we've talked a little bit about how there was this movement at the end of last year to really build up this sub community within Twitter for the marketing. And so you can see the largest bubble there is the handle that Christina G. That's Christina Garnett. And she started, I don't know if she originally founded the idea of the marketing Twitter hashtag, but what she did was she tweeted out this post talking about, if you want to make more connections, if you want to get more followers, then respond to this thread. And it really sort of took off in what you could consider a viral way. And so now, 3.5 months later, it's something that people are still talking about on Twitter, which is a big deal, especially in a social media space, for people to have that long of a memory on a social media platform, because things happen instantaneously and then you forget. And I constantly see two things happening. One is Christina is constantly boosting other people. She is retweeting people's posts constantly all the time. She herself is tweeting conversation starters. And then when people are posting, they are referencing her without her saying, hey, talk about me. And so that's why her bubble in this network graph is so big, because she's doing a lot of talking, but not talking at. She's actually having those meaningful conversations and conversation starter. She is engaging with people, and people are talking about her an awful lot because of what she did for that community. And she's still working to build it.
Yep. And for those who are listening to this episode and can't see what's on screen, if you go to trustinsights.ai/YouTube, you can see the video portion of this. We'll also put an image of this in the blog post over at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, so you can see what's going on, what we're referencing. But it basically looks like a big spider web with lots of little and big circles in it. So part of the reason why I think this is so important is that network graphs and graphing databases, these are not new. These have been around for 50-ish some odd years, and they're pretty straightforward to understand conceptually. When you have, say, two nodes, you and me, for example, and we communicate to each other in any fashion, you create these what are called edges, and it's basically it's a line connecting two dots, and the more you and I communicate to each other, the bigger that connection should get growing. Now, if you add in, say, our partner John, and John only talks to me, my dot on the map would get bigger than say yours or John's would, because we're there's more communication coming into my node. And what we want to do is take this data of who's talking to or about whom inside of Twitter and be able to or Instagram, and map this out to understand, oh, this is who is most talked about. And that gives us the ability to say, okay, I need to talk to Christina Garnett or Michelle Garrett or any of these other folks and say, like, yeah, let's have a chat with them and see if there's a way to organically and sensibly work ourselves into their mind space, the share of mind, so that when somebody says, hey, who do you know that can help with us with our analytics, we come up in their mind, and then that recommendation spreads to their community. The challenge with network graphing, well, there's a bunch of challenges. One, there's not a lot of technology out there that will process the data itself. Like the software, there's a ton of good software packages out there that do it, many of which are open source, like Neo4j, Gephi, iGraph, etc. But they all presume that you've got the data pre-processed, and almost nothing does it. We had to write our own software to do it because it wasn't anything else we could find that did it. And then you have to have some level of domain expertise in network graphing databases to know which algorithm to use. This is going back to what we were talking about earlier with Analytica. They use a harmonic centrality algorithm. We use an eigenvector centrality mechanism, and they're two almost opposite ways of looking at communications. We look at who's most talked about, and they look at who's doing the most talking.
It's interesting because I think that this is one of those really misunderstood pieces of the process. It always goes back to, what is the question you're trying to answer? It's so having that plan. And, part of that plan, as we've been talking about on the live, the So What live stream every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, is, that exploratory data analysis process, and really sort of coming up with the business requirements, the data requirements. And so not skipping over that piece of the process to say, do I even have the data in order to, answer this question? If the question is, who's the best influencer for my brand, then you need to know where that data is coming from. Do you want an Instagram influencer? Do you want a Twitter influencer? Do you want a Snapchat or a Clubhouse influencer? You need to decide, and then you need to figure out, does that data even exist?
Yep. And again, you're absolutely right. This is so important. Knowing your goals determines which algorithm you're going to use in a graphing database. If you just want a human being that you can stick a credit card into and ads come out, that's fine. That's a Kardashian.
That sounds like a terrible job.
I don't know. The Kardashians seem to be doing reasonably well. That's one type of influence. And in that case, you really do want the loudest, most engaged people. And for that application, it makes total sense. The challenge is those people tend to be very, very expensive. If you want that person who can broker deals, then Analytica's choice of like a harmonic centrality mechanism actually makes great sense, right? Because you want somebody who could say, okay, yeah, I know this person, and I can get you in the door with this person, and so on and so forth. But if you want somebody who is that thought leader who can boost your brand and reputation, then you want the first algorithm, the eigenvector centrality mechanism, because that person is the one everybody else looks up to as an actual authority. And so if you're not clear on your goals, you won't pick the right algorithm, and then you'll end up with the wrong influencers.
So let me ask you this question, Chris, because you've just described 3 algorithms. And so let's just go ahead and assume that the majority of marketers don't necessarily know which algorithm that they would want. If they do their homework to say, these are my goals, this is the data that I have, this is the outcome that I'm looking for, do they need to understand how the algorithms work, or can they run the data until they get the right kind of outcome?
So marketers without the technical background are a little bit stuck because, and this is not their fault, a lot of the influencer marketing companies will not disclose what algorithm they use. They say, we have our proprietary in-house, blah, 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 the usual sales garbage. And they won't tell you what's in the box. And so you'll just get, lists of influencers back, and you don't know how they were chosen. And chances are the person you're working with at the company also has no idea, because they aren't the ones who engineered the software. The only way that you can be absolutely positively sure how it was selected is if the company tells you,
Mhm.
which, again, props to Analytica for being willing to admit, like, yes, this is exactly the algorithm we use. And now I know when they have the use case for what they're describing works and when it doesn't. Or
Mhm.
you got to build it yourself, because otherwise, I don't trust anybody who says this is a proprietary algorithm. We won't tell you anything about it. Like, you can tell somebody the core algorithm underneath the hood without giving away the secret sauce of how you process the data and how what cutoffs you make for saying, yeah, this is the selection cutoff. You don't have to give away the secret sauce to say, like, yeah, this is what it is. It's like going to a restaurant saying, here's our mystery dish. Well, no. Is it a sandwich? Is it a sushi? Like, you don't have to tell me the exact ingredients, but just tell me what it is I'm going to eat. The same is true with this stuff. It's like, say,
Mhm.
just tell me what's generally you're doing under the hood, and most of these companies won't.
So ideally, if I'm following correctly, ideally, if I did my homework, I put my plan together and I said, I want someone who is a conversation starter. I want someone who has, you know, a big network, doesn't have to be like millions of people, but it has to be the right kind of network. If I go to one of these companies, they should be able to say, yes, my eigenvector centrality software does that. Like, so you don't have to understand what eigenvector centrality is, but they should be able to say, our algorithm looks at total number of followers. Our algorithm looks at total engagement, total reach, likes, retweets, whatever it is, and combines that for one general influencer score. Like, they should be able to break it down for you in those terms. They don't have to give you the exact like formulas of it's like xy plus b plus rq squared equals 95. But to your point, Chris, it sounds like they should be able to say, this is what we consider in our algorithm that gives you the output in plain English.
Ideally, yes.
Right,
It's not
ideally.
very common. It's not very common. It's not very
Mhm.
common. It is one of the reasons why we've had to build a lot of this stuff ourselves, because we could not get that information out of somebody else. And I'm not
Mhm.
saying you have to go and build your own software, although certainly it does help. If you influencer marketing is going to be a part of your core strategy, you might want to invest the time and the resources to build some of the software yourself, or work with an agency that does it for you.
Mhm.
But if it's not, then yeah, just, I guess, pick vendors and hope it works out. But I've not found a lot of companies that are willing to even be the slightest bit forthcoming, because I think in some ways they feel like that it's a commodity, and if they give away any part of the recipe, somebody else could steal it. And I think there's some truth to that, but at the same time, it's there's so much that goes into the construction of software like this, that
Mhm.
even small changes along the way can make a big difference in the end outcome. It's just like cooking. You just put in a
Mhm.
pinch too much salt at one point in the process, and then you're basically eating a salt lick at the end, as opposed to the dish you were looking
Yes.
for. Something is You were just saying about, I want who is most talked about, but I also want a certain following size. Now
Mhm.
you're talking and you think about the data. Okay, I have a cutoff point, and then some data will not get included. And you have to know, if you're
Mhm.
building this stuff, where in the process do you make that cut? Naively, you might think, I'll cut it off at the beginning, but then you won't get all the mentions from lesser folks
Mhm.
in terms of audience size who are talking about that other person. So you have to know in the process where to make that cut. So there's a lot of nuance, even to a very simple set of requirements like you just gave. And so it's really important that those requirements be very explicitly declared.
Well, and I think that, your point is well stated of, you know, the way that I would program an algorithm versus the way that you would program the algorithm. We could take the exact same algorithm, but because you and I are different people, it's going to
Mm-hmm.
come out differently because we have our own set of ideas. Even if we start with the exact same set of requirements, the exact same algorithm, the exact same data, I think that's something that, these companies that are trying to black box it are forgetting is that, you know, their team, the composition of their team is unique to them. That's what's proprietary. Then, so if you can, reverse engineer what the algorithm is, your outcome is still going to be different from theirs because you are not them. And
Yep.
I know we always kind of come back to, like, at the end of the day, humans are the ones who program these algorithms, but that's the bottom line, is that you, the human, are the start and the end of the process.
Yep. It's like the shows on YouTube. There's a hilarious series of, like, a celebrity versus an expert chef, and they both try to make the same dish, and obviously the celebrity has no cooking experience, just completely hoses it. Same tools, same ingredients, same process, but the human behind it, like the master chef makes this amazing looking dish, and the celebrity's ends a pile of flaming garbage. Like, it's very clear that expertise does matter and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess to summarize, when it comes to this, to influencers and network graphing and all this technology, you have to know what's in the box. If you don't know what's in the box, even conceptually, you don't know that the results you're being given are good or bad. Again, going back to a food analogy, if you don't know how a dish is made and you say you have an allergy, you could be in a lot of trouble. So those requirements up front really matter when it comes to influencer marketing. The process matters, and the people, not only who are you're trying to manage for influencers, but who's building the stuff for you, or who the agencies that you're working with. You've got to know the people too. It's almost like people, process, and platform actually matter together more than they do individually.
That's a weird concept, Chris. So if you can bring up that graphic again one more time as we close out. So, as we've been talking about the different algorithms, so if you were to post this on a social media platform and say, we did a network graph of the influencers, the first question that most people should be asking is, what does this mean? And we can tell them, well, we used Gephi, we pulled Twitter data, and the question that we wanted to answer was, who is being the most talked about? If you are looking for influencer marketing software to tell you who are the influencers, and they can't answer those basic questions for you, then you should probably, run away screaming, or, gently walk away. Either way, you need to know how it works. And so we are telling you straight up how we do it. We use Gephi. We pull the data straight from the networks themselves. And oftentimes we are looking for who is the most talked about and who is making those connections.
Yep. And if you'd like to see more of this, go tune into our live stream show, So What? I believe we're going to do it in a couple of weeks, do a walkthrough from beginning to end of the process, so you can actually see a good chunk of the process yourself. So that's Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern time. You can find that over at trustinsights.ai/YouTube for our YouTube channel, which is one of the main places it airs. If you've got questions about what we've talked about in today's episode, head on over to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, our free Slack group. We're 1,600 people now, chatting all things analytics and a bunch of other fun stuff too. We just added like 12 new channels on a whole bunch of work-life balance stuff. And again, wherever you're watching or listening, if you want to head over to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast for other ways to consume content, which is whatever is most convenient for you, we got all the options there. Thanks for watching and listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Want help solving your company's data, analytics, and digital marketing problems? Visit trustinsights.ai today and let us know how we can help you.